a number of components that all come together to create a narcissist.
With narcissistic traits, it's not only the children who are neglected, but even the children who are overly praised.
Is it a case that it will run through a family line? It is maybe not biologically hereditary, but it could be hereditary.
We all have traits of different symptoms, conditions, whatever you want to call them.
But at the same time, it is tragic, isn't it? It's a tragic, tragic story. Welcome to a new series here at the She Word, the series Living with a Narcissist. It's not about you. Now, you may recall back in season 3, at the end of season 3, we had a show dedicated to narcissists and narcissistic abuse and how you can survive that and how you can build out of that. But over the course of the last couple of weeks and months, so many of you have gotten in touch with us in relation to that episode. So many people reaching out and saying, I identify with that. I identify with that situation. Can we talk more about it? So we said, yes, this is what we're going to do. So we are just starting today a 5-part series looking at the various aspects of living with a narcissist and making sure that we make it clear that this is not about you. If you are in that situation, whether it be a parent, whether it be a sibling, whether it be another family member, it could be a partner, it could be a work colleague, it could be a friend. We're going to guide you through the process of understanding that situation and dealing with that situation. And I want to start off by saying as well that not everybody who is a little bit mean or a bit grumpy or a bit moody or a little bit overbearing or over-controlling is a narcissist. And also in this series, we're looking at narcissistic personality, not narcissistic personality disorder, which has its own topic and own way of looking at that. So we're just going to be talking about narcissistic personality. And again, I just want to reiterate that not everybody who's a little bit grumpy is a narcissist. We are looking at this in depth. And I'm thrilled to be able to be joined by Claire Borg. This is your second time with the She Word.
Yes, it is.
And I'm delighted to have you here again. And you are here with the opening of this series. And I think just before we go into what we're going to be looking about, and today we're going to be discussing whether a narcissist is born or whether they are created. I think that's incredibly important to understand what we're dealing with. But I just want to touch base on why this is so important to have these conversations. Because if you are dealing with anybody in your life who is a narcissist, it can be incredibly damaging.
Definitely. And I think we've been hearing about it so much over the past years that we do need to talk about it in a way where we don't necessarily demonize people, because obviously everyone has their own strengths and their flaws, but at the same time, we need the awareness to know how to deal with people who have these presentations, because yes, there could be a lot of harm. So
absolutely. And it's also, we'll be talking over the course of the next 5 shows, how to deal with the effects, how to control, how to protect yourself, how to identify. We'll also be looking at what you can do to deal with a narcissist, what the do's and don'ts are of dealing with a narcissist. But we're kicking off today, as I said, we're looking at how narcissists come into being. And the big question is, are they born like that, or are they created? And this is incredibly important, because I when I think about this topic, I think, how can you have someone in a member of a family who is a wonderful human being and a sibling who is very narcissistic, whether that be overt or covert or any of these other areas of narcissism. So I'm going to kick off with the big question. Is a narcissist born a narcissist? Is it hereditary?
Well, obviously, I'm going to say it's a bit of both, because you are opening up a huge debate, which is the nurture-nature debate, which we talk about a lot in psychology when we talk about mental health, psychopathology. So we would usually say there might be genetic predispositions, but usually what happens in the environment in a person's upbringing would usually then either highlight those predispositions or not. So some people are more likely to develop these traits, but then the upbringing, the nurture element is also very, very crucial. Usually we do talk a lot about trauma and upbringing when it comes to narcissistic adaptations and presentations, but obviously everyone is very different. So even with people having these presentations, you will notice differences because we are all unique. So even within a family, I mean, no one is exactly the same as their siblings unless you're an identical twin, and still there will be differences because of what happens in life. Your genes are essentially different. So there's a similarity, obviously, but you're not 100% identical. So that's why we can't always tell whether, you know, it's genetic, it's nature or nurture. Usually it's a bit of both.
Okay. So it's a combination. You've got to have all of the factors there to make this situation possible for somebody to develop a narcissistic personality. So what are the factors? You mentioned before about trauma, but as I understand it, it's not always just about trauma. It could be over love and over expectations.
Yeah.
What is it as easy to say, you know, you could grow up in a traumatic home, you're going to be a narcissist? Because that doesn't sound right.
Well, usually what happens is that if there is neglect from the parents, if the child feels unseen, not validated, then the child will grow up into an adult still craving this need. So essentially that is why sometimes we see people who are adults who act in very childish ways, because there's what we would call this developmental arrest, sort of. So
it's just all stopped. That development has stopped.
It's kind of stopped in a way, yes, or rather it's a mature version, or not a mature, an adult version of what children would present. So we would see a mismatch between the person's biological age and the person's emotional age, let's say. So if someone is unseen, if they are neglected, then they might grow up wanting to be seen, wanting to be praised, wanting to be validated. And then that's why they would have this sense of grandiosity. But with narcissistic traits, it's not only the children who are neglected, but even the children who are overly praised. So if there isn't a balance and there aren't healthy boundaries, so there are no limits, so children grow up in an environment where whatever they do is perfect, they are better than everyone else, then this could also lead to narcissistic traits, because it's always about them and not the other. So there is a lack of empathy as well. Maybe they find it difficult to become attuned with the other. So there are these two extremes, either being not validated or neglected, or else overly validated in a way.
It's ironic, isn't it? That it's just, it could be one or the other.
Yes, or a bit of both, perhaps as well.
Does this start at any particular age? The reason I'm going to ask this is because if, as a parent or a family member, you see that this child is experiencing one of these extremes, or as you just said, both, and that they are starting to display this kind of narcissism from an early age, and you're a family member, you're an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or a brother or whatever, is it possible to step in and stop that from happening? Where at that developmental age does that become, okay, now that person is a narcissist, they have narcissistic traits, and you can't undo it? Because we're going to be looking later on in the next show on whether or not a narcissist can change. And from what I know, very rarely. So is there a point in that development where you can actually interject and you can stop what's happening and stop the outcome?
It's very hard to stop the outcome because we are influenced since birth. I mean, whatever we experience, will influence the way we perceive ourselves, others, and life. So even in the very first few days of life, we are already receiving information. So we do notice that babies who are a few days old would self-soothe if they are not soothed by someone, if they are not cared for. So in the first few weeks, let's say. So we already notice differences between babies in their first few weeks of life, not just because of their temperament, which is the biological aspect of personality, but also because of what is happening in the environment. So babies can be traumatized as well. So I'm saying this because as a family member, yes, you can try to intervene, let's say, or to show support or a different kind of upbringing. But if the child is being raised by parents and let's say they're not doing the best job at being parents, I mean, it's very difficult to overcome that, because if you're living with these parents every day, I mean, they are the most influential people in your life. So yes, your aunts, your uncles, grandparents, they are very influential as well, even teachers later on in life. But I think the most influential people are the ones who are raising you, parents or caregivers, the people you live with, essentially. I mean, you're in the same household, so you're observing, you're modeling. I'm not saying this because there is no hope, in the sense that if these children find other people in their life who support them, who help them label emotions or teach them healthy coping strategies, then yes, that would help. Or children who are in therapy or adolescents then later on in life. But the problem is that when someone is underage, even to go to therapy, I mean, they would need consent from their parents. So then if the issue is the parents, it's difficult even with relatives, because obviously then the relatives might be told, please leave it up to me. I am the parent, you know, or the caregiver or whoever. So it can get a bit messy and complicated, but there could be hope, yes, even in adults. So even if you've been living your whole life seeing things in a particular way, having certain traits, I mean, it's harder to change the older you get, but I can't say, and I will never say, that there is zero chance that someone will change, but it is quite difficult, yes. Or there might be small changes, but maybe still not enough to maintain healthy relationships, perhaps.
What if you could start your journey over? Start here and start again there. That's how life works, in a circular way. We understand the importance of circles, and that's why you are at the heart of ours. Find your way to wellness with Browns.
Learning about this, and when we sat down to start talking about this show and how we were going to approach it, I wanted to start from that point of how is it that narcissists come into an existence.
Yeah.
And one thing, listening to you and even having done my own research, is that became very apparent, is that you can't help but be so sad for an individual, because as you mentioned, that person that grows into a narcissist is quite often somebody who's been neglected and is just still seeking approval. Now, we have to be careful, of course, because if you're empathic, you can be pulled into that perfect storm, which we'll talk about later on in the series, and that will drain you and literally seep you, and you will become the supply for that need. But at the same time, it is tragic, isn't it? It's a tragic story.
It is. And children who are abused or who grow up in environments where they are neglected would not necessarily develop these traits, but they might develop other traits or mental health conditions. And we usually notice what we would call a comorbidity. So even with people having narcissistic traits or adaptations, there might be other issues such as substance abuse, for example, depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues as well. So I mean, I would naturally empathize with someone having that background. And as a professional, obviously that is my role if I'm working with someone having these traits. But in my personal life, and this is what I would say to anyone listening, you can be compassionate and you can empathize, but that doesn't mean that you need to remain in the relationship or whatever it is, the dynamic. So sometimes you need to leave because if it becomes toxic, then you need to save yourself, essentially. But you can still have compassion in a way, although this is usually then mixed with feelings of hurt and anger and guilt and shame and so many other emotions. So it's very complex, but I would definitely say that, yes, if you had to sort of take an objective stance in a way, when you think about adults showing these traits, yes, I think you can get in touch with what they were like as children, what they had to endure. And that is very sad. Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very tragic. So I just want to kind of summarize that again, and to get you to just identify that there has to be, from what I understand, there has to be a number of components that all come together to create a narcissist. And we talked about nature and nurture.
Yeah.
There has to be a bit of both.
Possibly. I mean, we can't know for sure. There's a lot of research that is ongoing, but we can never be presumptuous and say, yes, it's 100% nature or 100% nurture. So yes, usually it's a bit of both, but it depends, because there are so many variables, so many factors that come into play, that it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what might cause this. But obviously, if there is something that is happening in the environment, then it's easier to say, yes, that could have been part of it. So
okay. So we have these different components that come together, which could, from the environment, either be over-praise and over-elevation and over validation, or it could be completely the opposite. It could be neglect, and it could be abuse in that respect, or it could be a combination of both, because that can also happen.
It could happen because if there are two sets of caregivers, then one might treat the child in a particular way and the other would raise the child in a different way. It could also happen because there is ambivalence in the parents. So obviously parents or caregivers are human and they change, as we all do in life. So they might go through a period where they would be raising their child in one way, and then, I don't know, something could happen and it could change. Other people might be influential and would affect the child during their upbringing as well. So yes, it could happen. So a child could experience both, but usually it's one or the other. And most often when we talk about narcissism, we talk about the lack of being seen, which we find is usually more common rather than the children who are overpraised, let's say.
So I have a last question for you, Claire. And I think it's a question that everybody wants to ask and wants to know the answer to. And I'm pretty sure that maybe there isn't a definitive answer to this. But if that is the case, that a narcissist is a result of neglect or abuse, and they go there on to be in a situation, develop this personality traits, which we will look at later in the series, leads to further abuse. Is it a case that it will run through a family line? It is maybe not biologically hereditary, but it could be hereditary.
It could be. In psychology and psychotherapy, we talk a lot about transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma, where trauma is passed on. There are studies as well about epigenetics and sort of how trauma is stored in the nervous system, how it can affect you, even in a neurological, in a biological way. So that's why I said earlier, it's very complex. It's very hard to pinpoint, but yes, it can be passed on from one generation to another, also because we are influenced by what we see. That's why we talk a lot about role models, how important they are. So yes, we do tend to notice that it runs in the family, let's say. But someone then can break the cycle. It's very hard to do. It is possible. And we also talk about acquired security. So when we talk about narcissism, we're talking about not being seen, being insecure, like this deep-seated feeling of not being enough, being insecure. But in life, we can acquire security as well. So we can get it in healthy ways. Not always easy, not possible for everyone, unfortunately, but yes, I would like to say there is a bit of hope.
There is a bit of hope. Listen, Claire, thank you so much. Thank you for breaking that down. I really appreciate you starting off this series with such a strong, clear message. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.